The scent of time clung to her skin, a permanent perfume of aging paper, brittle leather, and the faint, sweet aroma of archival glue. Ilara Vance's world was a hushed sanctuary of silence, punctuated only by the delicate rustle of vellum and the soft scrape of her bone folder against a creased page. Her fingers, nimble and sure, traced the faded gold leaf on the spine of a 17th-century manuscript, a tiny island of light in the dim, dusty archive. In this controlled universe, she was a master, a healer of broken stories. Yet, beneath the surface of this monastic calm, a different kind of story was unfolding within her, one of a profound, aching emptiness, a silent plea for a life that felt as vibrant and real as the histories she so carefully preserved. To understand why she would soon make a choice that would shatter this fragile peace, you must see the gilded cage she called a life. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you are watching from. We continue. Her name was Ilara Vance, and at 22, she possessed a quietness that was often mistaken for simplicity. Her appearance mirrored her surroundings, unassuming clothes that didn't invite a second glance, hair the color of dried honey tied back in a practical knot, and eyes the shade of a stormy sea, holding depths most people never bothered to sound. As a rare book restorer, she spent her days breathing life back into things the world had forgotten, her delicate touch mending what time had torn asunder. It was a solitary profession, one that suited her disposition perfectly. She moved through the world like a ghost, her presence barely registering, a conscious choice to remain in the margins, to observe rather than participate. This self-imposed solitude was her armor, protecting a heart that felt far too fragile for the sharp edges of the modern world. This emotional seclusion was a fortress she had built brick by brick since childhood. She felt like a spectator to her own existence, watching the scenes of her life unfold from a great, insurmountable distance. Friends from her school days moved on, fell in love, made bold mistakes, and lived lives that were messy and loud and brilliantly colored. Ilara's life, in contrast, was a watercolor painting left out in the rain, the hues muted, the lines blurred, a study in shades of gray. The ache inside her wasn't one of sharp, identifiable pain, but a dull, constant thrum of unfulfillment. It was the heavy silence in her small apartment at night, the hollow echo of her own footsteps, and the persistent, nagging question of whether this quiet, half-lived existence was all there would ever be for her. At the very core of her being, protected with fierce, secret devotion, was her virginity. It was not a burden of shame or a consequence of trauma, but a principle, the last bastion of a romantic idealism she nurtured in secret. In the epic poems and timeless novels she repaired, love was a sacred covenant, an earth-shattering alignment of souls, a trust so profound it could withstand anything. She believed in that. She believed that intimacy should be a gift, an offering of one's most vulnerable self, given only in the presence of an unwavering and absolute love. This deeply held conviction made her an anachronism, a relic from another time, and it further isolated her. She was waiting for a love that felt as enduring and significant as the ancient texts she held in her hands, unaware that the world outside her dusty sanctuary rarely operated on such noble terms. Her life was not entirely of her own design. It was a tapestry woven with the threads of duty and love for her father, her only family. He was a man of gentle words and scholarly passions, the one who had first introduced her to the magic of old books. Now his quiet strength was fading, and the unspoken weight of his care fell upon her slender shoulders. Every decision, from her choice of profession, stable, close to home, to her frugal lifestyle, was dictated by the quiet needs of their small two-person world. Her own dreams, small and fragile things, were pressed between the pages of her mind like forgotten flowers. A desire to travel, to see the Italian cities where her books were born, to experience a single day of reckless, unburdened freedom. They were luxuries she could not afford, deferred for a future that seemed to recede with each passing day. The archive, therefore, was both her refuge and her prison. Sunlight struggled to pierce the tall, narrow windows, cutting through the thick air in hazy, golden shafts that illuminated swirling motes of dust. These particles were like tiny, captured moments of history, dancing in the stillness, The towering shelves of books rose around her like the walls of a canyon, shielding her from the noise and chaos of the city outside. Every object held a story, every spine a promise of another world. But it was a world of ghosts, of lives already lived, and stories already concluded. The silence was profound, a heavy blanket that could feel like a comforting embrace one moment and a suffocating shroud the next. She was the keeper of these sleeping tales, and in doing so, she had allowed her own life to fall into a similar, dreamless slumber. The sudden, shrill ring of her mobile phone was a violent intrusion, a modern sound that had no place in her ancient world. It shattered the sacred silence, making her flinch. She was in the middle of applying a minuscule fleck of gold leaf to an illuminated letter, an act requiring the steadiest of hands and absolute concentration. At the sound, her hand jerked, a tremor of shock and annoyance running through her. The delicate gold square, no bigger than a sequin, tore, smudging against the pristine vellum. A gasp escaped her lips. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible mistake, one she could likely fix, but it felt like a terrible omen. The perfect, controlled surface of her day had been fractured. As the phone continued its relentless ringing, a cold dread began to seep into her veins, a premonition that the call was about to tear a far greater hole in the fabric of her carefully constructed life. The journey home from the archive was a descent, a daily pilgrimage from the hushed reverence of the past into the gritty, unapologetic present. Her neighborhood was a patchwork of tired brick buildings and faded storefronts, a place where dreams went to rust. The air, thick with the smells of exhaust and fried food, was a stark contrast to the clean, dry scent of ancient paper. Here, survival was a louder, more urgent story than the one she curated. Alara moved through the crowded sidewalks with her practiced invisibility, her gaze fixed on the cracked pavement, her shoulders hunched against the indifferent energy of the city. This was the other side of her life, the one defined not by gilded spines and illuminated manuscripts, but by peeling paint, overdue bills, and the pervasive, gnawing anxiety of simply getting by. Their small, third-floor apartment was a testament to a life lived on the margins of financial security. It was meticulously clean, a space where love fought a constant battle against decay. The furniture was old but cherished, the wood worn smooth by years of use, the upholstery faded from 1,000 afternoons of sunlight. A constellation of water stains mapped the ceiling, a silent record of past leaks. This was her father's world, and by extension, hers. Every object held a memory, but lately, these memories felt heavy, like anchors holding her in place. The apartment was both a sanctuary of familial love and a cage built of financial necessity, its walls seeming to close in a little more each day, squeezing the very air from her lungs and suffocating the quiet, hopeful whispers of her own future. Her father, Arthur Vance, was a man whose mind was a library of forgotten lore and beautiful poetry, but whose body was becoming a traitorous vessel. Once a history professor with a booming laugh and eyes that sparkled with intellectual curiosity, he was now diminished, a pale echo of his former self. He spent most of his days in a worn armchair by the window, a book resting unread in his lap, his gaze lost somewhere between the grimy rooftops and the overcast sky. A persistent dry cough racked his thin frame, each spasm a painful reminder of the illness that was systematically dismantling him. Ilara's love for him was a fierce, protective thing, a deep and aching devotion that formed the very bedrock of her existence. It was this love, pure and absolute, that was also her most profound and inescapable obligation. Their evenings fell into a quiet, predictable rhythm, a ritual of comfort against the encroaching darkness. Ilara would prepare a simple meal, the small kitchen filling with the modest aroma of soup and bread. They would eat at the small wooden table, the conversation circling around safe, familiar topics. A particularly interesting manuscript she was working on, a memory from her childhood, a passage from a book he was trying to read. She would often read aloud to him after dinner, her voice a soft, steady presence in the dim light, weaving tales of ancient heroes and impossible love. These moments were precious, islands of peace in a turbulent sea of worry. Yet an unspoken tension always lingered beneath the surface, a shared knowledge of the ticking clock they both pretended not to hear. The official diagnosis arrived not with a dramatic confrontation in a sterile office, but with the cold, impersonal finality of a letter. The thick cream envelope, bearing the insignia of the city's most prestigious hospital, felt like a death sentence in her hands. Ilara read the words, the medical terminology, a cruel, alien language that translated into a single, brutal truth. NIGE progressive idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, a rare, aggressive disease with a grim prognosis. But then came the sliver of hope, a cruel mirage in the desert of their despair, an experimental treatment, a new therapy showing promise, a chance. She read the paragraph again and again, her heart seizing on that single word, a chance. The paper trembled in her hand, the clinical black ink blurring through the sudden, hot sting of tears as the full weight of what it meant settled upon her. The hope, however, was tethered to an impossible reality. Tucked behind the diagnostic report was a second sheet of paper, a cost estimate for the experimental treatment. The number was obscene, a figure so vast it seemed to belong to another world, the world of the glittering skyscrapers she could see from her window, not the world of third-floor walk-ups and second-hand furniture. It was a sum that represented more money than her father had earned in his entire lifetime, more than she could hope to earn in 10. She spread their financial documents across the small kitchen table, bank statements, unpaid bills, her modest pay stubs. The two piles were a visual representation of their life, a mountain of debt and a small, pitiful mound of resources. The chasm between what they had and what they needed was not a gap, it was an abyss. That night, sleep was an elusive stranger. Ilara lay in her narrow bed, staring at the shadows dancing on her ceiling, her mind a frantic storm of calculations and dead ends. The number from the estimate was branded onto the back of her eyelids, a glowing, mocking figure. She felt a suffocating pressure in her chest, as if the weight of all that money was physically crushing her. She rose and moved silently through the apartment, a ghost in her own home. She stood in the doorway of her father's room, watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. His breathing was shallow, punctuated by a faint, wheezing sound. In the faint moonlight, he looked so fragile, so vulnerable. The fierce, desperate love she felt for him was a physical pain, a fire in her gut that burned away all thoughts of herself, her future, her own quiet dreams. The following days were a blur of polite but firm rejections. She spoke to bank loan officers who looked at her with a mixture of pity and condescension, their practiced speeches about collateral and credit scores sounding like a foreign language. She spent hours on the phone with insurance administrators, navigating automated menus and indifferent agents, only to be told that experimental treatments were not covered. Each no was another brick in the wall that was closing in around them. The system, with its rigid rules and unfeeling bureaucracy, was an impenetrable fortress. She was a single, powerless young woman, armed with nothing but love and desperation, and it wasn't nearly enough. The world was not designed to accommodate miracles for people like them. It was designed to protect its own cold, unyielding logic. Arthur, with the keen perception of the gravely ill, understood her silent panic. One evening, as she sat staring blankly at a pile of medical forms, he reached out and placed his thin, trembling hand over hers. "Ilara," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "It's all right. We've had a good life, you and I." He was trying to absolve her, to release her from the impossible burden he had become. He spoke of acceptance, of peace, but his words had the opposite effect. They were a testament to his goodness, to the gentle soul she was so terrified of losing. His attempt to set her free only shackled her more tightly to her sense of duty. How could she possibly give up on a man who was willing to give up on himself for her sake? His love, in its purest form, had become the most unbearable pressure of all. Standing at her small bedroom window late one night, Ilara gazed out at the city. The skyline was a jagged line of glittering towers, monuments of glass and steel that pierced the dark sky. They were symbols of immense power and unimaginable wealth, a world so far removed from her own it might as well have been on another planet. Down below, life went on. Cars streamed by like rivers of light. People lived and loved and dreamed, oblivious to the quiet war being waged in her third-floor apartment. A profound sense of isolation washed over her. She was utterly, completely alone in this fight. It was in that moment, staring at the cold, distant lights of the city, that a dangerous, terrifying thought began to form. If the conventional world had no solutions to offer, perhaps she would have to look for one in the unconventional. A door had to open. Any door. The name Julian Thorne arrived not as a person, but as a dangerous rumor, a last resort whispered by a harried legal aid lawyer who saw the sheer, unyielding desperation in Ilara's eyes. He was a phantom in the city's financial stratosphere, a man spoken of in hushed, fearful tones. They called him the Architect of Ruin, a title earned for his uncanny ability to dismantle corporations with surgical precision, leaving behind nothing but fiscal wreckage and the ghosts of failed competitors. He was not a builder but a demolitions expert of the highest order. Hearing his name felt like being handed a live grenade. It was a terrifying, monstrous solution, yet it was the only one that had materialized from the ether of her despair. A single, treacherous spark of possibility ignited in the suffocating darkness of her fear, a flicker she was both drawn to and repulsed by. The meeting was to take place in his world, a sterile fortress of glass and steel that punctured the clouds. The penthouse was less a home and more a gallery of cold, calculated success. Its vast, open spaces were sparsely populated with minimalist furniture that looked more like sculpture than anything meant for human comfort. Floor-to-ceiling windows presented the city below not as a vibrant collection of human lives, but as a silent, sprawling map of a kingdom he commanded. The air was cool and filtered, carrying no scent of life. No food, no books, no people. Ilara felt like a smudge of dust in a pristine laboratory, her worn coat and scuffed shoes, a violation of the immaculate white marble floors. Every step echoed, amplifying her sense of trespass, of being a foreign organism in an ecosystem where she did not belong. He did not walk into the room. He materialized in its center, as if the space itself had coalesced to form him. Julian Thorne was a man carved from unforgiving materials. His suit was a shade of charcoal so dark it seemed to absorb the light around him, tailored with a severity that allowed for no imperfection. His face was a composition of sharp angles and controlled planes, a mask of aristocratic indifference that gave nothing away. But it was his eyes that truly held her captive. They were the color of a frozen lake, intelligent and utterly devoid of warmth. His presence was an immediate, oppressive weight, a gravitational pull that warped the very atmosphere of the room. He didn't need to speak to assert his dominance. His stillness alone was a declaration of absolute power, and Ilara felt the air thin in her lungs. His gaze moved over her, and it was not an introduction, it was an inventory. There was no flicker of interest, no hint of human curiosity. It was the detached, analytical assessment of an expert appraising an object for acquisition. He noted the simple, mended fabric of her dress, the absence of jewelry, the nervous way her fingers were laced together. Ilara felt herself shrink under the clinical scrutiny, feeling every inadequacy, every marker of her humble origins, being catalogued and filed away. She felt like a specimen under a microscope, her very soul being examined for its utility. In a surge of desperate pride, she forced herself to meet his gaze directly, lifting her chin just a fraction. It was a small, silent rebellion, a refusal to be completely erased, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of something, not surprise but acknowledgement, in those icy depths. When he finally spoke, his voice was as controlled and devoid of inflection as the rest of him. It was a low, resonant baritone, a voice accustomed to issuing commands that were never questioned. He did not waste time with pleasantries or preambles. "You understand the terms of the proposal," he stated, not asked. "It is a business arrangement, a contract with a duration of 7 days. You will perform the duties of a wife in name only, a signature on a legal document. In exchange for your compliance and absolute discretion, the full sum for your father's medical care will be transferred to a trust in his name. The transaction will be clean, swift, and final." The words were like polished stones, each one smooth, hard, and cold, stripping the situation of all humanity and reducing it to a set of clauses in a soulless agreement. A wave of nausea churned in Ilara's stomach. Every word he spoke was a desecration of the sacred ideal she had held so close to her heart. Marriage, love, intimacy. He spoke of them as commodities to be bought and sold, line items on a balance sheet. The revulsion was so strong it was a physical taste, bitter and metallic on her tongue. Her entire being screamed at her to run, to flee this cold, empty place, and the man who embodied it. But then, an image seared itself onto the back of her eyelids. Her father, his face pale against his pillow, his breath catching in a painful, rattling cough. The image was a powerful anchor, holding her in place. This was not about her principles anymore. It was about his life. Her heart was caught in a brutal vice, squeezed between the purity of her convictions and the fierce, absolute power of her love. As he continued to outline the non-negotiable conditions, separate residences within the mansion, no personal inquiries, a strict public facade, his voice momentarily faltered on a single word. "There will be no pretense of fidelity," he said, and the word came out laced with a faint, almost imperceptible trace of venom. For a split second, the mask of indifference cracked, and Ilara saw something raw and unguarded in his eyes. It was not anger, but a deep, ancient wound, a flash of profound bitterness that was gone as quickly as it appeared. It was the briefest glimpse into a sealed-off chamber of his soul, a place where trust had been murdered and buried. She realized then that his coldness was not an absence of feeling, but a fortress built around the ruins of a devastating emotional betrayal. That fleeting glimpse of his pain did something terrible to her. It planted a dangerous seed of curiosity in the barren soil of her revulsion. The question of why he was this way began to echo in her mind, a quiet, insistent whisper. What kind of wound could encase a man in a glacier of his own making? The restorer in her, the part that was drawn to broken, forgotten things, felt a disquieting pull. She knew how to handle fragile, damaged histories, how to trace the source of a tear and gently mend the damage. This man was the most broken thing she had ever encountered, and the thought that she was even considering him in this way filled her with a profound sense of self-loathing. It was a treacherous fascination, an empathy she could not afford to feel for the man who was about to purchase a piece of her soul. The immense room fell into a heavy, expectant silence. The city hummed a distant, muted song beyond the glass walls. Julian Thorne stood perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back, waiting for her answer. He was not impatient. He was certain. He had assessed her desperation and calculated the odds. It was just another negotiation, and he never lost. Ilara's gaze drifted from his cold, impassive face to the sprawling city below, a world of millions of lives, none of which could help her. She thought of her father's gentle hands turning the page of a book, of his fading smile. The choice was an illusion. There was no choice. When she finally spoke, her voice was a ghost of its usual self, a fragile, trembling sound that was swallowed by the vastness of the room. "Yes," she whispered. "I agree." The moment the word left her lips, the transaction was complete. Any hint of the man behind the wound vanished, replaced by the cool efficiency of the magnate. He gave a curt nod, as if finalizing a stock purchase. "My solicitor will be in touch with you within the hour to execute the necessary documents," he said, his tone clipped and final. He turned away from her then, his attention already shifting to a sleek tablet on a nearby console, dismissing her as if she were no longer there. The brief, intense connection, the silent battle of wills and the fleeting glimpse of vulnerability, was severed. Ilara was left standing alone in the center of the cold, white marble floor, the echo of her own surrender hanging in the air. She had just sold her innocence, and the weight of its price began to settle upon her, a crushing, invisible burden. The days that followed were a study in silence, a cold war waged across the vast, polished surfaces of Julian's penthouse. Ilara moved through the opulent spaces like a phantom, her presence both undeniable and ignored. The violation of the first night had not been a brutish, passionate assault. It had been a cold, calculated act of erasure, a deliberate dismantling of her most sacred principle. He had sought to prove that everything, and everyone, had a price, and in her own mind he had succeeded. The shame was a physical weight, a cloak of lead she could not shed. She felt hollowed out, a beautiful, fragile book whose spine had been deliberately broken, its pages left exposed and vulnerable to the cold, sterile air of his world. She avoided his gaze, she avoided mirrors, she avoided the very thought of her own body. Julian, for his part, retreated behind an even thicker wall of glacial indifference. He immersed himself in his work, his days a relentless succession of phone calls and video conferences, his voice a low, commanding drone that seeped under her door. Yet, his legendary focus was fractured. Her silent, spectral presence was a constant, unnerving distraction. He would find himself staring at the empty chair at the dining table where she refused to sit or catch her scent, a faint, clean smell of old paper and soap, lingering in a hallway. He had acted to reassert control, to put her back in the box of a simple business asset, but his actions had done the opposite. He had created a complication he could not quantify, an emotional variable that had no place on his spreadsheets, and the disquiet it stirred within him was as unfamiliar as it was infuriating. They existed in separate orbits that occasionally and tortuously intersected. Mealtimes became a theater of excruciating tension. A silent servant would lay out elaborate meals on the long, dark wood of the dining table, meals neither of them had the appetite to eat. The clink of a fork against porcelain was an explosion in the cavernous silence. He would stare at financial reports on the tablet, his jaw tight, while she would push a piece of asparagus around her plate, her gaze fixed on the intricate patterns of the silverware. Each refused to acknowledge the other's presence, yet they were hyper-aware of every subtle shift in posture, every shallow breath. It was an intimate, unspoken war, a shared punishment where the silence itself became the most powerful and damning confession of what had passed between them. To escape the suffocating confines of her suite, Ilara began to explore the mansion. It was less a home than a monument to wealth, a cold gallery of Julian's success. Art, chosen for its investment value rather than its beauty, hung on sterile white walls. Furniture was arranged with geometric precision, untouched and uninviting. The entire space felt preserved under glass, devoid of life, memory, or warmth. It was the architectural embodiment of the man himself, impressive, powerful, and utterly empty. She would run her fingers along the cold marble of a countertop, or the smooth, hard leather of a sofa, feeling no connection, only a profound sense of alienation. This gilded cage was a constant, glittering reminder of the transaction. The opulence, a vulgar counterpoint to the quiet, dignified poverty she had left behind. On the third day, a small, defiant spark flickered to life within her. She could not bear the oppressive order, the soulless perfection of his world. While he was out for a rare meeting, she walked into the cavernous living room, a space dominated by a wall of glass overlooking the city. The heavy, blackout curtains were always drawn, plunging the room into a perpetual twilight. On impulse, driven by a desperate need for light, she pulled the thick velvet aside. A brilliant cascade of afternoon sun flooded the room, illuminating motes of dust and setting the cold surfaces ablaze with light. It was a small, simple act of rebellion, a reclamation of a single sunbeam in his carefully curated darkness. It was her saying, without words, "I am still here. You have not erased me completely." When Julian returned, he stopped dead in the entryway, his eyes narrowing at the unaccustomed brightness. He saw her standing in the patch of sunlight, her form silhouetted against the dazzling cityscape. For a moment, she looked ethereal, an apparition of light in his world of shadows. His first instinct was a surge of sharp annoyance at this disruption of his controlled environment. He opened his mouth to issue a cold command, to tell her to close them, to restore the order she had violated. But the words died on his tongue. He saw the quiet determination in her posture, the subtle lift of her chin. She was not cowering, she was waiting. And in that moment, he felt a flicker of something other than anger, a grudging, unsettling respect for the resilience he had tried so hard to break. This small victory emboldened Ilara, shifting the tectonic plates of her internal landscape. The shame and fear, while still present, were now joined by a dangerous and compelling curiosity. She began to watch him when he wasn't aware, studying him from a distance. She observed the way a muscle in his jaw would clench when he was on a difficult call, the rare moments his guard would drop when he stared out at the city, a profound loneliness etched on his face. She started to see him not just as her violator, but as a complex, deeply wounded puzzle. The revulsion she felt was now at war with a treacherous empathy. She was a restorer of broken things, and she recognized in him a fracture so deep it seemed to have shattered his very humanity. Her explorations eventually led her to the one place in the mansion that felt different: the library. Unlike the rest of the penthouse, this room was filled with the warmth of dark wood and the rich scent of old leather and paper. Books, real books with worn spines and dog-eared pages, lined the walls from floor to ceiling. It was a sanctuary, a pocket of a soul in an otherwise soulless place. It was the first time she had felt a flicker of kinship with him, a shared love for the tangible weight of a story in one's hands. She spent hours in that room, the silence here a comforting embrace rather than an oppressive weight, feeling a fragile sense of peace for the first time since her arrival. It was a room that held secrets, and she felt an irresistible pull to uncover them. Tucked away in a forgotten corner, behind a row of dry legal texts, she found it, a large, leather-bound portfolio. It was not part of the curated collection. It was personal. With trembling fingers, she opened it. Inside were not corporate blueprints or financial projections, but dozens of breathtaking architectural sketches. They were drawings of public spaces, libraries with soaring, sunlit atriums, community gardens, and elegantly designed low-income housing. The lines were fluid, passionate, and idealistic. Tucked within the portfolio were journals from his university days, the pages filled with an elegant, sloping script that spoke of building things that would last, of creating beauty and utility for people, not just for profit. It was a ghost of another man, a vibrant, hopeful young dreamer who had once existed within the cold shell of Julian Thorne. A profound, aching sadness washed over Ilara as she carefully turned the fragile pages. This was the man he was supposed to be. This was the soul that had been buried alive beneath layers of wealth, power, and a bitterness so deep it had poisoned everything it touched. The clinical, transactional monster who had bought her and broken her was himself a ruin, the ghost of a beautiful dream. The empathy she felt was no longer treacherous. It was a deep, painful, and overwhelming wave of compassion that threatened to drown her. This discovery changed everything. It did not excuse what he had done, but it recontextualized it. His cruelty was not an inherent part of his nature. It was a scar, a defensive wall built around the rubble of his former self. She waited for him in the library that evening, the portfolio resting on the large mahogany desk. When he entered, his eyes immediately fell upon it, and for the first time she saw a flicker of raw panic in his gaze. He looked like a man whose most secret, shameful wound had been laid bare for the world to see. Ilara didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse him. She simply slid one of the most beautiful sketches, a design for a free children's hospital, across the polished surface of the desk towards him. Her voice when she spoke was barely a whisper, imbued not with anger, but with a genuine, heartbreaking sorrow. She looked directly into his shocked, frozen eyes and asked the one question that could shatter his world. What happened to him? The man who drew this? His entire body went rigid. The question struck him with the force of a physical blow, bypassing every defense he had ever constructed. No one had ever asked him about that man. He had spent a decade burying him, pretending he never existed. Her quiet, sorrowful query was more devastating than any corporate attack, more invasive than any public scandal. It was an act of seeing. She had looked past the monster he presented to the world, and had found the ghost he kept chained in his own soul. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't speak. The mask of the architect of ruin crumbled, and for a split second she saw him, a man drowning in a sea of his own making. Without a word, he turned and walked stiffly from the room, leaving her alone with the evidence of his lost humanity. The aftermath of that confrontation was a palpable shift in the atmosphere of the penthouse. The oppressive silence was replaced by a different kind of quiet, one that was charged and electric, humming with everything that was now exposed between them. He no longer ignored her. Instead, his gaze would follow her as she moved through a room, a look of confusion, anger, and a terrifying vulnerability in his eyes. He was seeing her for the first time, not as a contract or a problem, but as the one person who had managed to breach his impenetrable fortress. He had taken her innocence, and in return, she had stripped him of his armor, leaving them both raw and exposed in the echoing silence of his home. Ilara's internal world was in turmoil. The clear lines of her moral universe had been irrevocably blurred. The man who had violated her was also the man whose lost dreams made her ache with a compassion so intense it felt like a physical pain. This new knowledge gave birth to a terrifying and unwanted feeling: desire. It was not a simple physical attraction, but a deeper, more complex yearning. It was the desire to understand his pain, the desire to reach across the chasm he had created and touch the wounded man she now knew existed. She hated herself for it. This feeling was a betrayal of everything she was, a desecration of her own suffering, and yet, it grew stronger with each passing, tension-filled hour. One evening he found her in the library, curled in a large leather armchair, reading one of her own worn paperbacks from home. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, simply watching her. The harsh lines of his face seemed to soften in the warm, dim light. He walked in, his footsteps unnaturally quiet on the thick Persian rug. "You prefer that to any of these?" he asked, his voice low, gesturing to the thousands of priceless volumes surrounding them. There was no condescension in his tone, only a genuine, unvarnished curiosity. "Sometimes a story feels more real when the pages have been touched by someone's hands," she answered softly, not looking up. He said nothing more, but he remained in the room, sinking into an armchair opposite her, the two of them reading in a shared, fragile silence that felt more intimate than any touch. The fragile truce was shattered by an accidental touch. As they passed in a narrow hallway, his arm brushed against hers. The contact was fleeting, a mere whisper of fabric against skin, but it sent a jolt of pure electricity through both of them. Ilara gasped, her breath catching in her throat, the warmth of his body a shocking, searing brand against her skin. She looked up and met his eyes, and saw her own shock reflected there. His cool composure was gone, replaced by a raw, unguarded hunger that made her heart hammer against her ribs. The air crackled between them, thick, with a sudden, suffocating sexual tension that was both terrifying and undeniably thrilling. He took a half-step back, as if burned, his jaw clenching as he fought for control. Later that night, Ilara stood at her window, staring at the glittering, impersonal lights of the city below. She could still feel the phantom heat where his arm had touched hers. The man who drew beautiful, hopeful buildings, and the man who had coldly asserted his power over her were one and the same. Her revulsion and her desire were now inextricably linked, a tangled, chaotic knot in the pit of her stomach. She had come here to save her father, to perform a sterile, loveless duty. But she was no longer a passive participant. She realized with a dizzying wave of horror and clarity that she wanted something from him, something more than the money. She wanted to break through his walls, to understand his ruin, to feel the humanity she had glimpsed. She was beginning to desire the very man who represented the destruction of all her ideals. The faint, lingering warmth on her skin from his accidental touch in the hallway was a treacherous ghost, a phantom sensation that refused to fade. Ilara sat on the edge of her bed in the cavernous, silent suite, her hands trembling in her lap. The battle raging within her was a silent, brutal war. One part of her, the part that remembered the cold violation of the first night, screamed in revulsion. But another, newer voice, a voice that had read the hopeful words of a young dreamer and seen the profound pain in a broken man's eyes, whispered a different, more dangerous truth. She could not simply endure the remaining days in this silent torment. The space between them had become a vacuum, and if she did nothing, it would suffocate them both. In that moment, a decision crystallized, an act of transgression against the established order. She would not wait. She would seek him out. She would force the ghosts into the light. She found him in the vast living room, a solitary figure dwarfed by his own success. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling window, a dark silhouette, against the glittering tapestry of the city at night. A glass of amber liquid, likely whiskey, was held loosely in his hand. He hadn't turned on the lights, preferring the cold, distant glow of the metropolis he commanded. He looked less like a man, and more like a monument to loneliness, a king ruling over an empire of empty rooms. As she stepped softly onto the marble floor, her presence a quiet ripple in the stillness, he didn't turn. He knew she was there. The air thickened, charged with 1,000 unspoken words, the tension, a physical thing that pressed in on her, making it difficult to breathe. This was his inner sanctum, his throne room of isolation, and she had just committed an act of invasion. He would have hated this, Ilara said, her voice barely more than a whisper, yet it carried across the cavernous space with perfect, devastating clarity. Julian's shoulders stiffened, the only sign he had heard her. The man who drew those libraries, the man who dreamed of sunlit courtyards for children, he would have hated this cold, empty darkness. Her words were not an accusation. They were a eulogy for the man he had murdered within himself. He finally turned, his face a mask of cold fury, but his eyes were a storm of raw, unguarded pain. "You know nothing," he bit out, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You live in a world of fairy tales and crumbling paper. You have no idea what it takes to hold this." He gestured vaguely to the city. "To protect it. Idealism is a luxury you can afford. I cannot." His words were meant to be scalpels, to cut her down, to remind her of her place in this transaction. "You speak of dreams as if they have no cost," he continued, taking a menacing step towards her, the whiskey sloshing in his glass. "But you, the quiet idealist, you learned the price of things, didn't you? You took the money. You signed the contract. You sold that precious sacred thing you held so dear. You are no different from anyone else. Everything, and everyone, has a price. You proved my point more beautifully than I ever could have imagined." He was trying to rebuild the wall between them, to cast her back into the role of a simple commodity, to reduce the profound complexity of her sacrifice into a base, cynical transaction. But the desperation in his voice betrayed him. He was trying to convince himself as much as he was trying to wound her. Ilara did not retreat. She held her ground, her gaze unwavering, seeing past the cruel words to the terrified man behind them. "You're wrong," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I didn't sell anything. I sacrificed it. There's a difference. I gave up a part of myself to save someone I love more than my own life. It was a choice made from love, not from greed." She took a step closer, closing the distance he had tried to create, her eyes searching his. "The real question, Julian, isn't what my price is. It's who did you ever love enough to sacrifice anything for?" The question landed with the force of a physical blow, striking at the very heart of his ancient wound, the raw, festering memory of a love that had been nothing but a calculated, venomous betrayal. The carefully constructed edifice of Julian Thorne shattered. The glass trembled in his hand, a fine tremor running through his entire body. The mask of power and control dissolved, revealing the raw, unvarnished face of his agony. "Love?" He choked out the word as if it were poison, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Love is a weapon. It's a lever used by the weak to pry wealth from the strong." "She didn't love me," he whispered, the words raw and broken, confessing his deepest shame to the one person he had tried so hard to dominate. "She loved this. The name. The power. The buildings. When she thought she could have it all without me, she tried to burn my world to the ground." He finally looked at Ilara, his eyes stripped bare, filled with a terrifying, bottomless despair. "There is no love. There is only the transaction." In that moment, he was no longer the architect of ruin, the cold magnet, the man who had violated her. He was just a man, profoundly and utterly broken, drowning in the wreckage of his own past. A wave of compassion so powerful it stole her breath washed over Ilara, erasing every last trace of fear and revulsion. She moved towards him, her step silent and sure, crossing the vast, empty expanse of marble that had always separated them. He watched her approach, his body frozen, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a desperate, fragile hope. He looked like a castaway who had just spotted a ship after years of being lost at sea, uncertain if it was salvation or a mirage. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of their shared, ragged breathing. She reached him and did not hesitate. Her fingers gently closed around his hand, the one holding the glass, and she carefully pried it from his grasp, setting it aside on a marble console. The clink of glass on stone was the only sound. Then, With an infinite tenderness, she raised her other hand and cupped his jaw. His skin was cold, but a muscle jumped under her palm. He flinched at the contact, a lifetime of guarding himself against any form of gentle touch warring with the desperate need for it. He let out a shuddering breath, his eyes closing for a single, heartbreaking second. It was an act of complete and utter surrender, a white flag raised after a decade-long war. In that one, silent gesture, she had offered him something he thought he would never feel again: unconditional acceptance. When he opened his eyes, the raw, primal need she saw there was a force of nature. It was a hunger for connection, for solace, for a single moment of genuine warmth in his frozen world. He didn't speak. He simply leaned into her touch, his head tilting down as his mouth found hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was a desperate, frantic collision, a drowning man's gasp for air. It tasted of expensive whiskey and the salt of unshed tears. It was a raw, chaotic expression of all the pain and loneliness he had held inside for years. His hands came up to grip her arms, not with force, but with the desperation of a man holding on to his only anchor in a storm. It was a kiss that broke every rule, every contract, every carefully constructed wall between them. This was the true transgression, the final, irrevocable surrender. He pulled her closer, his desperation a tangible force that she met not with resistance, but with an answering need of her own. Her arms wrapped around his neck, her fingers tangling in his hair, holding him as if she could piece together the broken parts of him through sheer will. The kiss deepened, moving from frantic need to a slow, burning exploration, a silent language of shared pain and burgeoning desire. He led her from the room of cold shadows, their bodies moving as one, a seamless, inevitable progression towards the warmth and privacy of his bedroom. This was not a transaction. It was a confession. It was the complete and total dismantling of two solitary worlds, a desperate, beautiful, and terrifying fusion in the heart of the silent, gilded cage. The first light of dawn was a cold, clinical intruder, slicing across the vast, unfamiliar landscape of Julian's bedroom. Ilara awoke with a start, the space beside her in the enormous bed, a stark, empty expanse of cool, rumpled silk. He was gone. The only evidence he had been there at all was the lingering scent on the pillow, a complex, masculine fragrance of expensive cologne, whiskey, and something uniquely him, a scent that now felt like an indictment. The raw, desperate connection of the night had evaporated with the darkness, leaving behind a chilling, profound silence. A wave of nauseating clarity washed over her. She had not found a man. She had lost herself. By surrendering to the fragile hope of his humanity, she had irrevocably complicated the simple, sordid contract, transforming her sacrifice into a devastating, indefinable mess. She was no longer just a signatory, she was an accomplice to her own emotional ruin. She found him in his office, a fortress of dark wood and gleaming technology. He was already imprisoned in a perfectly tailored suit, his back to her, as he stared at a wall of monitors displaying the silent, relentless pulse of the global market. The armor was back in place, thicker and more impenetrable than ever. The wounded man who had confessed his deepest pains in the dark was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating architect of ruin. He did not turn or acknowledge her presence, but the rigid line of his shoulders, the unnatural stillness of his posture screamed his awareness. The charged, electric silence that had hummed between them for days was gone. In its place was something dead and heavy, a suffocating vacuum of regret and denial, the shared, unspoken agreement of two co-conspirators to bury the body of what had just happened. Finally he turned, his face a mask of sculpted indifference, his eyes carefully avoiding hers as they focused on a point somewhere over her shoulder. He slid a single, crisp document across the vast, polished expanse of his desk. "The final transfer has been authorized," he stated, his voice flat, devoid of any inflection, the voice he used for business acquisitions. "The trust for your father's care is fully funded. The contract is complete." The word, contract, was a deliberate stiletto, aimed with surgical precision at the heart of the fragile intimacy they had shared. He was actively, cruelly reducing the raw, chaotic beauty of their connection back to its original, sordid terms. He was putting her back in her place, reminding her that she was, and had always been, a transaction. The words landed like a physical blow, confirming her most terrifying fear. For him, it had meant nothing more than a momentary, regrettable lapse in control. Ilara didn't even glance at the paper. Her eyes were locked on his face, a desperate, futile search for any flicker of the man who had held her as if she were his only salvation. She found nothing but a cold, empty void. The hollowness in his gaze was a perfect mirror for the gaping ache that was opening in her own chest. A profound, silent understanding passed between them. This was the end. Without a single word, she turned and walked out of the room. She moved through the opulent penthouse like a ghost, collecting her few meager belongings from the guest suite. She left the expensive, beautiful clothes he had provided hanging in the closet, a silent, final rejection of his world and everything in it. Walking out of that sterile palace, she felt the crushing weight of the gilded cage lift. But she was no longer the same person who had entered it 7 days ago. The journey back to her small, third-floor apartment felt like a violent re-entry into a forgotten atmosphere. The familiar smells of aging paper, dust, and her father's illness wrapped around her, a suffocating blanket of reality. He was waiting for her in his armchair, his face etched with a week's worth of worry, his body looking smaller and more fragile than she had ever seen it. His hopeful, questioning eyes were an agony to behold. "It's done," she said, her voice sounding thin and foreign, a stranger's voice in her own throat. "I found a benefactor, an anonymous grant for the families of scholars. It's all taken care of." The lie was a shard of glass, tearing at her insides, but the look of pure, unadulterated relief that washed over his weary face was her only absolution. It was the reason, the justification, and the unbearable solitary burden she would now carry for the rest of her life. In the sterile perfection of his penthouse, Julian stood motionless as the sound of the heavy front door closing echoed through the unnatural silence. Her absence was not a quiet void. It was a deafening roar. The vast, empty spaces of his home, once a symbol of his power and control, now felt like a mausoleum. He walked with stiff, deliberate steps into his bedroom, the sight of the tangled sheets on his bed, a visceral, undeniable testament to the chaos she had unleashed upon his meticulously ordered world. With a sharp, violent motion, he tore the sheets from the bed, balling them up as if he could physically crush the memory they held. But it was useless. He had his empire, his legacy was secure. He had won. Standing alone in the echoing silence, surrounded by the cold trophies of his success, he had never felt so utterly and completely defeated. The days that followed were a form of quiet torture for Ilara. She sought refuge in the familiar, hushed sanctuary of the archive, hoping to lose herself in the steady, methodical work of restoration. But there was no escape. Her hands, once so sure and precise, now trembled as she applied delicate gold leaf to a medieval manuscript. Her mind was a traitor, replaying every moment spent with Julian, the coldness of his initial assessment, the flash of pain in his eyes, the desperate heat of his kiss, the weight of his body against hers. The intimacy they had shared was a relentless ghost that haunted her every waking moment and bled into her dreams. She felt a profound, suffocating guilt, a sense of having betrayed not only her own deepest principles but her father as well, by purchasing his life with a truth so ugly she could never speak it aloud. And yet, beneath the crushing layers of shame, guilt, and heartache, a new and unfamiliar feeling began to stir within Ilara. A fragile, resilient strength was taking root in the barren soil of her despair. The timid, invisible girl who had walked into Julian Thorne's life, terrified and compliant, was gone. She had faced down a titan, a man who built and destroyed worlds with a single word. She had looked into the abyss of his soul and had not flinched. She had met his power not with submission, but with a defiant act of seeing, of understanding. This realization did not erase the pain, but it fundamentally changed its nature. It was no longer the passive suffering of a victim, but the complex, bittersweet ache of a survivor who had discovered her own terrifying capacity for courage, compassion, and a world-altering desire. Julian's meticulously controlled world began to unravel at the seams. His legendary focus, the very tool with which he had carved out his empire, was shattered. During a critical merger negotiation, he found himself staring blankly at his oldest rival, seeing not a corporate adversary but the memory of Ilara's sorrowful eyes in his library. He was irritable, distracted, his famous composure cracking under a pressure no one could see. He had spent his entire adult life building walls, treating emotions as a terminal weakness to be exploited in others and ruthlessly suppressed in himself. Now he was drowning in them. The memory of her quiet dignity, her unexpected defiance, and her ultimate devastating compassion had become an obsession. He had acquired everything he had ever set out to own, but the victory was hollow, tasteless, a mountain of ash that cost him the only real, tangible thing he had ever held. They existed now as two solitary planets in the same solar system, forever bound by a shared gravitational pull but condemned to never touch again. From her small apartment window, Ilara watched the distant, glittering spire of Thorn Tower, a constant, painful reminder of the chasm that separated their worlds. In his glass fortress, Julian stared down at the sprawling city, a kingdom he commanded, feeling for the first time like a prisoner in his own castle. The 7 days were over, the contract was fulfilled, and the consequences were absolute. They were both ostensibly free, yet they had never been more profoundly shackled, bound to the memory of a desperate shared intimacy that had irrevocably ruined them for the solitary lives they were now forced to resume. The separation was not an absence, but a presence, a vast, aching silence that screamed with the impossibility of ever going back. 6 months passed, each day a quiet, steady stitch mending the torn fabric of Ilara's life. Her father's breathing grew easier, the experimental treatment a fragile miracle purchased at an unspeakable cost. She returned to the hushed sanctuary of the archive, her hands finding their old, steady rhythm as she mended the spines of forgotten books. But she was not the same. The silence was no longer a simple refuge. It was a vast, echoing chamber where the memory of Julian resided. She would trace the faded gold on a centuries-old cover and feel the phantom touch of his hand on her jaw, a memory both searing and sorrowful. She was no longer the timid girl who had traded her innocence for a life. She was a woman who had looked into the abyss, and in its reflection had discovered a terrifying, resilient strength she never knew she possessed. Julian Thorne had won his empire and inherited a kingdom of profound silence. The penthouse, once a symbol of his absolute power, had become his prison, its sterile, minimalist surfaces reflecting only his own solitude. He found himself inexplicably drawn to the city's oldest public library, a building he had designed in a past life, a ghost from his university portfolio. He would sit for hours among the quiet rustle of turning pages, watching families read to their children, seeing the simple, unvarnished connections he had long dismissed as a weakness. He was a foreigner in this world of gentle light and shared stories. Her absence was a physical presence, a constant, aching counterpoint to his hollow victory. He had successfully erased every trace of her from his home, only to find she had taken up permanent, defiant residence in his soul. The package arrived on a rain-swept Tuesday, a simple brown box addressed to her at the archive. Inside, nestled in layers of protective tissue, was a book. It was a first edition, impossibly rare, of the very collection of poems she had been reading in his library that one quiet evening. Her breath caught in her throat. There was no note, no card, only the book itself, its leather cover worn smooth by time, its pages smelling of history and care. She knew, with an instinct that bypassed all logic, that it was from him. It was not a gift of wealth, but a gesture of profound understanding. It was an apology written in her own language, a quiet acknowledgement that he had seen her, truly seen her, and had remembered. The carefully constructed walls around her heart began to tremble, threatening to collapse under the weight of this single, silent message. The book became a silent sentinel on her workbench, its presence a constant, low hum in the quiet of the archive. For weeks, she had fought to bury the memory of him, to frame their 7 days as a fever dream from which she had thankfully awoken. But this was not the act of a monster. This was the gesture of the man who dreamed of sunlit atriums. She ran a trembling finger over the embossed title, the worn leather warm beneath her touch. It was a bridge, a quiet invitation back across the chasm of silence and pain that separated them. She realized then that true closure was not about erasure, but about acknowledgement. To heal, she could not pretend it hadn't happened. She had to face the ghost of what they had been, and what they had done to each other, on her own terms, in her own time. She did not go to the cold, sterile spire of Thorn Tower. Instead, guided by a fragile, terrifying hope, she went to the old public library. She found him in the main reading room, a place of soaring arches and warm, afternoon light, a space born from his forgotten dreams. He was not the titan of industry. He wore a simple gray sweater, his posture unguarded as he watched the dust motes dance in the sunbeams. He looked up, as if he had been waiting, and his eyes met hers across the quiet room. The world seemed to fall away. There were no words, only a silent, shattering exchange. The ice in his gaze had melted, replaced by a raw, aching vulnerability and the flicker of a question he didn't dare ask. It was a complete and total surrender, an admission of his ruin and a plea for a grace he knew he did not deserve. In the profound silence of that sunlit room, a new and unwritten story began. It was not a promise of a happy ending, but the fragile, terrifying acknowledgement of a shared beginning. The space between them was no longer an abyss of pain and regret, but a blank page, waiting. He had given her father the gift of time. She, in turn, had given him back the ghost of his own soul. What they would build from the ruins of their shared past was a manuscript too delicate to predict, a work of restoration that would require a patience and tenderness neither was sure they possessed. If their journey to mend what was broken has touched your heart, and if you wish to see more stories of love finding its way through the darkness, we invite you to subscribe, share this story, and comment with your hopes for their future.